Hey, welcome to our first video talk, and on behalf of our leadership team, we hope you had a great Christmas. Some of you may have enjoyed your time with family. Others may have enjoyed time after your family left. Hey, no judgment here, we understand. And we appreciate you joining us today. We actually want to begin with a very important service announcement, which is the fact that you only have a few days left to buy eggnog. So if you need to stop watching and go to the grocery store, we support that kind of behavior. If you don't like eggnog, we're praying for you, praying for life change before next November. But thank you for inviting me into your living room or wherever you're watching from. And we are so grateful that we took this Sunday, December 30th, as a break from our normal Sunday roles. And to our team leaders and volunteers, we hope you are enjoying some much deserved rest. You've earned it. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today, the concept of rest. And my goal is to start the conversation, and our team has prepared some discussion questions that are going to come on the screen at the end. So if you're with your community group or some friends, you can simply press pause and start talking. If you're by yourself, we encourage you to share this video with a friend and have a conversation with them about it later. Because know this, our conversation is incomplete without your voice. So we encourage you to contribute because we need your perspective. So the title of our talk is really a question. Are you crushing it, or is it crushing you? See, in 2009, Gary Vee wrote a best-selling book called Crush It, where he talked about pursuing your passions with an incredible and really intense work ethic. So the idea of she's crushing it is prevalent in our culture. When we think about people who are willing to work long hours and go the extra mile or do whatever it takes to achieve their goal. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who seemingly don't want to do anything. Let's talk about it. Means discuss with little or no action. Or let's not even talk. Let's just watch Netflix or scroll on social media. Now, most of us are going to fall on this spectrum somewhere in the middle, and we'll probably naturally lean one way or the other, while recognizing that depending upon our season of life, we may go back and forth. And what's crazy is that most of us are tired no matter which end of the spectrum we're on. Whether we're crushing it in our career and working long hours or just crushing Netflix, a whole lot of us are tired. And when people ask us how we're doing, our default answer seems to be, I'm busy. Now, I'm busy maybe Netflix or working really hard. Either way, we just say, I'm busy. We say, I'm tired. So no matter where we fall in the spectrum, it seems like we're just not very good at rest. And that's why I think this conversation is worth having, whether you follow Jesus or not. And if you want some other resources, even beyond our time together, people beyond us are having this conversation. In fact, William Vest and Zach Camp, they're part of our public church family, and they have a podcast called The Good Content Crew, where they dedicate an entire episode to this idea of work and rest, and it's called Put in the Work. Or if you want a church leader who's wrestling with this, Mike Todd from Transformation Church, he kicked off 2018 with a series called Stride, the Pace of Grace. And in it, he talks about the difference between striving, which I do a lot, and striding, which is walking in long, decisive steps, or, as he calls it, the pace of grace. And if you like to read, Andy Stanley has a great book called Choosing to Cheat. That's at least the title when I read it. It's got some much longer updated title now, but you can find it. And it just talks about this whole idea of work-life balance. So the truth is, man, we all struggle with this on some level. So let's begin to talk about it by being authentic and asking this question. Are you crushing it, or is it crushing you? I know for me, I'm in a season where I feel like it's crushing me a whole lot more than I'm crushing it. You know, every week this unwanted visitor comes knocking on my door, and I try to lock the door and keep him out. But this feeling of being overwhelmed, it just keeps coming in. I mean, stuff begins to pile up. I don't know how to get it all done. I want to be a great husband and father, so I don't want to work too much, but there's so much to do. And at times, it's crushing me. Now, maybe you're currently crushing it, and if you are, please lend your voice to this conversation. Like, by all means, we need to hear from you. And no matter where we fall, here's a truth that we all recognize. To be our best, we must rest. Now, just because I don't practice that doesn't mean it's not true. And so let's take a few minutes to see how God defines rest. Because even if you don't believe in God, I think His concept of rest is at the very least intriguing. And I really believe it could be life-changing if we apply it. Because if we know that to be our best, we must rest, then here's another angle on that truth. If we learn to rest, we can become our best. So let's look at Genesis chapter 2. At the very end of the creation story, God is going to speak to us about rest. Genesis 2 verse 1 says this, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done." Now, when I first read verse 2 and it says He finished and He rested, I was like, hold on. Did He work on the seventh day? But in the original language, in the Hebrew, that word finish means something He'd done in the past. So on the seventh day, He's simply resting. And then verse 3 says, "So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation." So in the creation story, God is establishing a pattern for us to follow. And that pattern includes work and rest. Now, for those of you who naturally lean towards laziness or not doing anything, work is not a curse. I mean, God Himself worked and created everything. And I think forming the whole universe qualifies as some pretty intense labor. But at the same time, God wants us to know from the beginning that work and rest must go together. So our worship pastor, Cody, and his wife, Hannah, they take their precious daughter, Annie, to kinder music. And so they invited Liam to come, and so my wife, Whitney, and I, we've taken Liam. And the heart of kinder music is to harness the power of music to begin to teach and train these children from a young age. And they work on this rhythm. And the rhythm they work on is shake, 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 stop. Shake, 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 stop. And what the teacher wants them to understand is that silence is part of the song. And in the same way, from the very beginning, God wants us to know that rest is part of work. Again, to be our best, we must rest. So God shows us how to rest. He puts this pattern in place. The problem is, we struggle to implement it. We struggle to imitate His pattern. So in the first portion of the Bible, the Old Testament, God put some very strict rules called the Sabbath. And He tells His people, hey, you have to take an entire day off because they're struggling to follow His example. And when Jesus came, the strict rules around a specific day, those were no longer enforced, but the idea of Sabbath rest was still in place. In fact, Jesus has something specific to say about rest in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." What a promise! I mean, come on. Who's been tired in December? All of us. And Jesus says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." What an offer. And here's the type of rest that Jesus is offering to us. That we would lean away from productivity and we lean into His presence. And He continues this idea in verse 29, where He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Jesus invites us to be taught by Him, to follow Him. When He says that He's gentle and lowly, He's saying, guys, you can trust me. In other words, if we know that to be our best, we must rest, then Jesus also wants us to understand that our best and our rest are found in following Him. That we would lean away from productivity and lean in to His presence. And He goes on in verse 30 and says, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, we can misinterpret that verse and think that following Jesus is a cakewalk. That is not at all what He's saying. And His original audience would have understood that. They would have known that Jesus was contrasting the way of the religious leaders versus the way of Jesus. And we could get into the details, but here's the contrast. Working to get to God or accepting the work God has done to get to us. See, for the religious leaders and for so many religions and people today, to gain God's approval, we got to work and work and work, and we have to crush it. But with Jesus, God did the work to get to us. I mean, Jesus is God in a body. God came to earth. God came to us. And Jesus crushed it and was crushed on the cross. And that is the only way that we can get to God. So our role isn't to work. Our role is to accept the free gift of having a relationship with God that Jesus offers us on the cross. So if you're watching this and you've never accepted that gift, you can talk to Jesus right now and tell him, Jesus, I want to follow you because you died on the cross and you rose again. And if you're with your community group or with friends and you've got questions, ask those questions. If you're by yourself and you know a friend that follows Jesus, pick up the phone, call them, and ask your questions. See, God did the work to get to us. Will we accept it? See, following Jesus, it's not a cakewalk. We can count on adversity. But following Jesus is easier than the impossible task of gaining God's approval by our own work. And this leads us to the benefits of true rest. And again, when we think about rest, we're talking about leaning away from productivity and leaning in to Jesus' presence. And there are three benefits to this type of rest where we lean away from productivity and lean in to the presence of Jesus. So benefit number one is that we get access to God's no limits power. When we come to Jesus, he does what we cannot. I mean, we just said he died on the cross and rose from the dead to offer us what we could never earn, which is a relationship with God. See, our work is limited, but his power is limitless. And consider this, God created the whole world before we ever showed up. I mean, I think that can assure us that he can do more work while we rest than we could ever do by working nonstop. The second benefit of this type of rest is longevity. What does your car do when it runs out of gas? It stops working, doesn't it? And we've got warning lights and gauges, and for some of us, even this blinking digital reminder, get gas, get gas, get gas. If we ignore those warnings, then what's going to happen is our car stops working. In the same way, our bodies give us warning signs and reminders that we're getting too tired. And if we ignore those, the same thing's going to happen to us. We're just going to run out of gas, just like our car. But if we can learn to rest and refuel, then we contribute to our own longevity. So we've got to create habits that really force us to lean away from productivity and lean into his presence. And look, I know we're not guaranteed tomorrow, but if tomorrow comes, I'd like to be in a position to be used by Jesus. I don't want to be sidelined by burnout, in the hospital because I had a panic attack, or I'm suffering from some stress-induced disease. I want to be able to be used. And if I could speak directly to young leaders for just a moment, Craig Rochelle says something that I'm really trying to just figure out how to live out in my own life. He says this, young leaders often overestimate their short-term impact while underestimating how God could use them in the long term. Man, that's so true, and I do this all the time. So when we rest, we accept that God can use us more over the next 3 decades than he can over the next 3 weeks. And the final benefit to rest is that we are refreshed. Look, if we're not refreshed, then we're not really resting. And we may think that rest is just simply inactivity, but Jesus says it's more than that. It's a redirection of our energies towards him. I mean, Jesus said, come to me. That's a direction, and I will give you rest in his presence. So as we rest, if it's true rest, we must be refreshed in his presence. Because if we're not being refreshed, we're missing the type of rest that God intended from the foundation of the world. We may think that rest means we just veg out. And look, this time of year, there's some days that all I want to do is eat appetizers and watch football. And that can be good for us from time to time. But if that's all we do, we may find that we're tired, even if we have lots of free time. See, we need to actively rest by leaning into Jesus' presence. Here's some essentials that I need in order to be refreshed in his presence. I need time in his word with my journal. because my journal helps me pray. It helps me really intentionally reflect and write down prayers and also intentionally reflect and process the Word. I also need opportunities to exercise. One of my favorite ways to pray is to go for a run. And while I'm lifting, I love to listen to podcasts. And that leads me to my next thing. I need learning. Like, I am most refreshed when I'm reading a book and listening to podcasts as part of my routine. And then finally, I also need quality time with Whitney. When we have communication that's at the heart level, that refreshes me. So I can add other things, but those four are absolute essentials. And then, like, on a yearly broad scale, I really need time to travel. I need vacation. Like, if I were to cut all travel and cut a vacation out, then I'm going to be restless and I'm going to realize I'm missing that. So those are some ways that I can actively rest. Now the fun part. I invite you to lend your voice to the conversation. And just to jump ahead, we hope that next week you guys will join us at 9:30, 11:30, or 5:30 and kick off the new year at one of our gatherings. But between now and then, we hope this talk inspires every single one of us to take a step towards cultivating a habit where we lean away from productivity and lean in to the presence of Jesus. So, if you're with somebody, again, let's have the conversation. If you're by yourself, find a way to lend your voice to it. And let's begin by being authentic and just answering this question. Are you crushing it, or is it crushing you?